He laughed while 2 million black voters stood to lose their rights. That wasn't a mistake. It was a message. A Supreme Court justice smirked during a constitutional hearing as if our fight for the right to vote was some sort of joke. Across from him stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the freshman, black woman from Texas, sharp, unflinching, and fire-forged in courtrooms where rights were on trial long before today. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She asked the question every black elder watching had once whispered in their own hearts. Something funny about constitutional rights. Justice Kavanaugh. In that moment, power shifted. Because this wasn't just about one smirk. This was about decades of dismissal, centuries of silence, and one woman refusing to let that silence continue. This story isn't politics. It's personal. It's about who laughs and who's never been allowed to speak. It was just a smirk, barely a breath, a twitch of the lips on the face of a Supreme Court justice. But for those who know how injustice hides in plain sight, it was deafening. Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned forward slightly, his mouth curling with amusement, as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood before him, laying out her constitutional argument on behalf of millions of voters, many of them black, poor, disabled, elderly, forgotten. That smirk, it said everything. It wasn't about logic. It wasn't about law. It was about power, about who's expected to speak and who's supposed to stay quiet. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't come to stay quiet. She came to change the rules of the room. The chamber was silent, but not empty. It was filled with history not carved in marble, but carried in memory. The marches in Selma, the fire hoses in Birmingham, the voter registration cards denied in Mississippi because someone couldn't name all the county judges. This was not just another legal argument. This was the continuation of a fight our people have waged for centuries, and one that some thought had long since ended. But justice has a way of calling out the pretenders, and history has a way of showing up uninvited. On that day, it arrived in the form of a black woman in an emerald green suit, standing alone, but not unarmed. Crockett's presence was sharp and composed. But make no mistake, she walked into that chamber with ghosts behind her. The voices of Fannie Lou Hamer, the defiance of Barbara Jordan, the steel of Shirley Chisholm. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was standing where too many had been barred from standing and saying what too many had been punished for saying. And when Kavanaugh chuckled, he wasn't just laughing at a legal point. He was laughing at us, at the idea that our voices, our votes, our vision for democracy deserved to be taken seriously. He underestimated the woman in front of him, and he forgot the weight of the people standing with her, even if he couldn't see them. The thing about power is it rarely expects to be challenged, especially by someone it doesn't deem worthy. That's why the silence in the chamber hit like thunder when Crockett, calm and unshaken, looked him in the eye and asked, "Something funny about constitutional rights. Justice Kavanaugh." That sentence didn't come from ego. It came from centuries of being told to wait, of being told to sit down, of being told to be grateful for what you've been given. It came from knowing the law so well. You could bury someone in their own precedent. And it came from the unshakable clarity that dignity is not up for debate. For too long, people in power have gotten away with chuckling at our pain, at our neighborhoods being redlined, at our schools being underfunded, at our ballots being questioned, at our mothers standing in line for 6 hours just to cast a vote. That day, Crockett didn't just fight for voting rights. She fought for something deeper, the right to be taken seriously, and in doing so, she turned a smirk into a moment that would ripple far beyond that courtroom, a moment that would echo through Twitter feeds, Sunday sermons, barbershop debates, and kitchen table conversations across the country. A moment that said, "We see you, we hear you, and this time, we will answer back." Because when someone laughs at your right to vote, you don't laugh back, you rise. Justice Kavanaugh smiled. Jasmine Crockett stood. The rest is about to become history. They weren't guesses. They weren't opinions. They were facts. And they came in threes. 3 major universities. 3 separate studies. All came to the same conclusion. The new voting law would disproportionately block black, elderly, disabled, and working-class Americans from the ballot box. And Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, she didn't walk into that courtroom hoping for respect. She brought receipts. The data clearly shows these ID requirements disproportionately impact low-income communities. She began, her voice calm, but cutting. Behind her, a digital screen lit up with maps, red counties, blue counties, and black counties, the ones most affected. In some of those places, DMV offices had been quietly shuttered. In others, Sunday, voting, a sacred tradition for black churches, had been eliminated. These aren't random side effects, Crockett said, turning to face the bench. These are targeted impacts, and the law's designers knew exactly what they were doing. Justice Kavanaugh shifted. The smirk was gone. He tapped his pen, glanced sideways. A storm was coming, and Crockett controlled the forecast. She outlined the hurdles. An 82-year-old man in rural Georgia, now needing to drive 70 miles round trip to a licensing office that opens 2 days a week. A single mother of 2 in Mississippi, working double shifts, unable to take time off to get the new form of ID now required by law. A 6-7-year-old woman in Alabama, a veteran turned away because her utility bill didn't match the name on her voter file. These weren't hypotheticals. They were real people. And Crockett, once a civil rights attorney, had met them. She'd represented them. She'd fought for them. Now, she was speaking for them. You said in Crawford v. Marion County, she reminded Kavanaugh, that any regulation placing disproportionate burdens on identifiable voting groups requires heightened scrutiny. She paused. I've just presented you with disproportionate burdens. I've identified the groups. What more do we need? The room stayed silent except for the furious typing of journalists who knew something historic was happening. Kavanaugh tried to cut in. Congresswoman Crockett, he interrupted. Are you suggesting all voter ID laws are discriminatory? She didn't blink. No, Justice. I'm saying this one is because it was designed to be. Behind her, the screen shifted again. A bar graph appeared showing the demographic breakdown of registered voters who lack the newly required ID. 63% were black. 71% lived below the poverty line. Almost half were over 60. And when early voting hours were slashed, who suffered most? Those who couldn't afford to leave work, those who relied on buses that no longer ran after 5 p.m., those whose legs couldn't take standing in line for 5 hours but stood anyway. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts were doing the shouting for her. Then she did what few expected. She turned the law against itself. This law claims to prevent fraud, she said, but not a single verified case of voter fraud has been linked to the methods it restricts. Not one. She cited Department of Justice data, just 31 credible cases of fraud out of over 600 million votes cast nationwide in the last 2 decades. 31. That's not justification, she said. That's paranoia. And paranoia is not a constitutional standard. What is? Consistency. Kavanaugh had built his judicial legacy on it. Now Crockett was holding it up like a mirror, and the reflection wasn't flattering. Her words weren't just legal argument. They were memory. They were the voice of generations told. Come back later. Told. You're in the wrong line. Told. You're not eligible anymore. But on that day, the record showed otherwise. That day, a black woman stood before the most powerful court in the land and gave them the kind of evidence they couldn't unhear, the kind of truth they couldn't ignore. It wasn't her voice that stopped the room. It was her silence. Right after the smirk, right after the chuckle, Justice Kavanaugh let it slip a small, audible laugh as Jasmine Crockett cited a landmark 1,965 case on voter suppression. He shook his head slightly, just enough to signal what he thought of her argument. Dismissive, patronizing, predictable. And then Crockett stopped. The words halted mid-sentence. The chamber fell still. Even the reporters stopped typing. Even the justices sat a little straighter. The silence lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it felt like a shift in the earth. Then came the sentence that would echo around the nation. Something funny about constitutional rights. Justice Kavanaugh. No yelling. No anger. Just steel sharp and unyielding. It was the kind of question that demanded an answer. Not out of protocol, but out of principle. Kavanaugh blinked. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being held accountable in real time, by someone he had just tried to diminish. He tried to recover. I'm simply noting that the precedent you cited has been substantially narrowed by subsequent rulings, but it was too late. The balance in the room had shifted, and Crockett wasn't backing down. Then perhaps, she said slowly, you could explain your perspective, rather than laughing at mine. Because the millions of Americans whose rights are at stake deserve more than a chuckle. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar. From across the bench, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson adjusted in her seat. Observers would later note the faintest hint of a smile on her face, not of amusement, but of recognition, because every black woman in America knew exactly what Crockett was facing in that moment. Not just a legal test, a cultural one, the test of whether she would be emotionalized, stereotyped, dismissed, or whether she would meet condescension with clarity and win anyway. And Jasmine Crockett, she came prepared. If you find my citation amusing, Justice Kavanaugh, she continued, then let me direct your attention to your own words from Crawford v. Marion County. That was the turning point. The screen behind her flashed. A quote from Kavanaugh's own opinion appeared, bold and undeniable. Voting regulations that place disproportionate burdens on identifiable segments of the voting population require heightened scrutiny to ensure the fundamental right to vote is not impaired. The courtroom froze again. This time, it wasn't her silence. It was his. Kavanaugh's face turned stiff. The pen tapping stopped. He started flipping through his notes, fumbling for cover. Crockett didn't let up. That was your standard, Justice Kavanaugh, she said. And today, I've presented overwhelming evidence that this law exceeds that very threshold. He began. The circumstances in Crawford were different. Different circumstances. She interjected. Same constitutional principles. She wasn't reacting. She was leading. Behind her, the second quote appeared, this time from Kavanaugh's own 2021 speech at Notre Dame. Consistency in the application of legal principles is the bedrock of judicial integrity. Crockett let the silence linger again. She didn't need to prove anything. The proof was already in his words. I'm not asking for special treatment, she said finally. I'm asking for consistency. Apply the standard you created. Apply heightened scrutiny. Follow your own logic. This wasn't just a clapback. It was a legal trap, and he had walked right into it. If you believe this is what Black America needed all along, say truth in the comments below. Because what happened next wasn't just about law. It was about power. Kavanaugh, who minutes earlier had chuckled, now sat upright, his face flushed, either with anger or embarrassment. No one could tell for sure. Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett, he said quickly. Justice Kavanaugh, did you have a question? Kavanaugh paused. Then a rare sight. A Supreme Court justice, at a loss for words. He managed, I want to clarify that I wasn't dismissing the importance of voting rights. But Crockett was already ahead of him. With respect, she said. Your chuckle spoke volumes. And in that moment, the courtroom belonged to her. By noon, the moment was already everywhere. By 1:00 p.m., it had a name. Crockett shut down. The clip of Jasmine Crockett calmly confronting a chuckling Supreme Court justice had gone viral in record time. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. But she had done what millions wished they could. Demand, respect, and back it up with truth. News anchors paused their programming. Legal scholars jumped online. And from barbershops in Detroit to porches in Mississippi, Black elders watched and whispered one word over and over again. Finally, someone had said what they'd been shouting at their TVs for decades. Finally, someone stood in that chamber, not asking, but insisting that their voices mattered. By evening, the ripple had become a wave. 3 moderate senators, previously undecided on voting rights legislation, announced they would now vote in favor of the bill. Their reasoning: they had been moved by the clarity and constitutional grounding of Crockett's argument. In Washington halls, the vote count was shifting. In neighborhoods across America, something deeper was shifting too. Civil rights organizers launched emergency voter registration drives, naming them after Crockett. TikTok, of all places, flooded with young people breaking down legal precedent, using her exact language. And in Crockett's own district, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Her staff received over 15 000 calls and emails in 48 hours. Not just from Texas, but from all 50 states. Some said thank you. Some said they cried. Many shared personal stories of being turned away at the polls. A retired teacher in North Carolina wrote, "I've been voting since the 60 seconds. Watched rights expand, then watched them erode. Today, for the first time in years, I felt defended." At college campuses, law professors added the transcript to their syllabi right next to Brown v. Board and Roe v. Wade. Crockett's showdown had become a case study in constitutional advocacy, but it wasn't just her logic that struck a nerve, it was what she refused to do. She refused to shrink, refused to play polite when dignity was on the line, refused to let a chuckle be the final word. She didn't just expose a double standard, said a legal analyst on MSNBC. She used it, flipped it, and made the justice answer to it. That's not just advocacy. That's strategy. Her calmness wasn't detachment. It was power. The kind black women have carried for generations in courtrooms, classrooms, and kitchen tables, long before anyone gave them microphones. If you believe this is the kind of leadership our democracy needs, say we rise still in the comments. Because something else was rising too. Pressure on the court. Behind the scenes, Supreme Court clerks were shaken. Source reported quiet conversations among justices about decorum, bias, and the court's eroding public trust. Justice Kavanaugh, once praised for his confident demeanor, now found himself the subject of late-night monologues and editorial cartoons. He hadn't lost an argument. He'd lost something harder to regain: credibility. A former clerk admitted anonymously, "The optics are terrible." He got caught dismissing a legitimate argument, and she used his own words to call him out. The public noticed too. Within 5 days, a nationwide poll revealed 72% of those who watched the clip had a more favorable view of Crockett. 54% had a less favorable view of Kavanaugh. 68% believed the court should adopt clearer standards around courtroom conduct. These weren't partisan numbers. They were human numbers. Because everybody knows what it feels like to be laughed at when you're telling the truth. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't gloat. She didn't post. She went back to work. Behind the scenes, her team began collecting the testimonials, pouring in, organizing them into a digital archive. She made a promise. They would become part of the official congressional record. She understood this wasn't just her moment. It belonged to the people who'd been ignored, dismissed, silenced, and still showed up. The reversal wasn't just that Kavanaugh lost the exchange. It was that millions of Americans suddenly saw themselves winning in that courtroom, in that suit, with that voice. And once that door was opened, there was no shutting it again. 6 weeks later, the ruling came down, and the court did something nobody expected. In a 6-3 decision, the United States Supreme Court upheld the voting rights protections that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had fought for. It wasn't just a win. It was a reversal of momentum, and it had Justice Kavanaugh's name on it. He signed the majority opinion joining Chief Justice Roberts in language that stunned legal scholars and lit up cable news. When regulations place disproportionate burdens on identifiable segments of the voting population, the opinion read, they must be subject to heightened scrutiny to ensure the fundamental right to vote remains accessible to all eligible citizens. Those weren't just legal terms. They were Crockett's exact words from that day in the courtroom. This wasn't just precedent. This was proof. Her argument had landed. A freshman congresswoman had walked into the highest court in the land, invoked Kavanaugh's own standard, and weeks later, watched him write it into law. The impact was immediate. States across the country hit the brakes on pending voter restriction bills. Advocacy groups filed new lawsuits, now armed with the strongest legal backing in years. And across Black America, the ruling felt less like a legal update and more like a spiritual victory. In barbershops, elders nodded. In churches, ministers preached on standing firm in the face of laughter. In classrooms, kids replayed that one sentence over and over again. Something funny about constitutional rights. Justice Kavanaugh. The moment had become a movement. Searches for heightened scrutiny shot up 0% in 1 week. Law school applications in civil rights law programs jumped 43% that semester. And Crockett, she went from freshman representative to national voice for democratic integrity. If this story proves anything, say Congress can hear US in the comments because this time, it truly did. Her district office overflowed with volunteers. Fundraising for her re-election campaign broke records with small-dollar donations from all 50 states. She was invited to deliver the keynote at 3 law schools' graduation ceremonies, including one that had previously ignored her scholarship applications as a student. Political analysts now openly speculated about her future in party leadership. Some even mentioned her name alongside cabinet positions and Senate aspirations. But Crockett kept the focus on the work. She reminded every interviewer that the victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every voter who had ever been told to go home and try again. Every elder who couldn't get to the polls. Every young activist who registered 5 people and felt it wasn't enough. I didn't come to D.C. to go viral, she said in one interview. I came here so nobody gets to laugh off our rights again. Back at the Supreme Court, things were changing too. Behind the velvet curtains and closed doors, justices reportedly discussed formal rules on courtroom decorum and implicit bias training quietly. But seriously, clerks noticed a shift in tone. Senior staffers noted increased attention to how female and minority advocates were treated in oral arguments. One legal insider said simply, "She changed how the court listens." Literally, even Kavanaugh, who had not commented publicly, seemed different. At a later speaking engagement, he said, "Judicial integrity rests not only on legal reasoning, but on how we conduct ourselves in every setting." He didn't name Crockett. He didn't need to. The nation knew. Legal education would never be the same. Her exchange became required reading. Professors played it in first-year lectures. Advocacy workshops built entire seminars around it. She didn't just win a case, said one law dean. She redefined the blueprint for holding power accountable with composure, with evidence, and with courage. Fashion blogs dubbed her courtroom outfit Power Green. Civil rights organizations created digital toolkits based on her style of argument. Parents told their daughters, "That's how you walk into a room that wasn't built for you." And across social media, the same quote kept reappearing. You don't have to accept disrespect no matter who it comes from. The decision changed the law, but the woman behind it, she changed the conversation. Jasmine Crockett showed the nation what it looks like when a black woman walks into a room full of robes, full of power, full of assumptions, and leaves with the law behind her and the people beside her. This wasn't just a victory. It was a reminder. Democracy only works when we defend it boldly, unapologetically, and together, a year later, the marble floors of Capitol Hill have long forgotten the sound of that chuckle. But the fire it sparked, it's still burning. Jasmine Crockett's legacy didn't end with a courtroom victory. It began there. In the months that followed, civil rights groups used her words to train new generations of advocates. Black churches played clips of her speech before voter drives. Elders passed down her name like they once spoke of Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan. This wasn't just about a law. It was about dignity. She had stood firm not just for a policy, but for every voice that had ever been cut off, talked over, or dismissed. At a newly opened voter resource center in her district, a man in his 80s clasped her hand. "I never thought I'd live long enough to feel heard," he said, through tears. "You made us believe the system might still care." Her green suit, once just fabric, is now a symbol, a quiet signal of resistance, courage, and truth. At law schools, students quote her. In communities, mothers name daughters after her. And across the nation, a simple phrase became a battle cry. You don't have to accept disrespect no matter who it comes from. She didn't just correct the record, she rewrote the page. This moment, this spark, has become a movement, because what Crockett showed the world is that democracy isn't protected by tradition. It's protected by people willing to speak truth to power, even when power laughs in their face. And now, millions stand ready to do the same. Speak black truth. Justice rising. We rise still.